Hello everybody and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be doing actually a top 10 about 10 things that I dislike about Disney era Star Wars. So there are a couple things I want to say first. The first thing is that this is not limited to just the movies. Most of these things do have to do with the movies and they are about the movies, but a few of them are about some other aspects of things that have happened with Star Wars since Disney bought it back in 2012. And secondly, I am not making this video to necessarily hate on Disney's Star Wars. In fact, I actually really enjoy all 4 of the movies they've released. If you saw my top 10 Star Wars movies list that I released last week, you would know that Rogue One and The Last Jedi were in my top 5 out of all the Star Wars movies. So this isn't to say that I dislike what Disney is doing with Star Wars or anything at all like that. These are just things that I think could be done better or could have been done better. So with all of that stuff out of the way, let's start off with number 10, which is that it seems like they're starting to get away from telling the Skywalker story. Now, I know, personally, at least for me, if they had made Rey as Skywalker, it would have been incredibly predictable, and there would have been just no surprise to it at all. I personally liked what they did with her in The Last Jedi, making her parents, like, pretty much nobodies, making her a nobody. It does bug me a little bit that the new movies are getting away from telling the Skywalker story, since George Lucas himself said that episodes 1 through 6 were the Skywalker story, and Star Wars, at least with the main movies, is about the Skywalkers, because, of course, the prequels are about Anakin, and then the originals are about Luke and also Darth Vader, who is Anakin. So that is kind of a thing that bugs me. It doesn't bug me a whole lot because I think overall what they're doing with the new movies is pretty okay, but that is still something that I would have liked to see if they had continued with the Skywalker story, at least keeping Luke alive until the end of episode 9, because then it would have still counted. But now that he's gone, there are, as far as we know, there are no Skywalkers left. Number 9 isn't really something that is currently happening, or at least not to the extent that I fear it might, but it's something that I think could happen pretty close into the future, maybe like within another 5 years, depending on what happens, and that is oversaturation. There are 2 reasons I put this on the list, because for me, the closest thing I can compare this to is the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which, I'm not saying those movies are bad, because all of the ones, or at least most of the ones that I've seen, were pretty good. However, first thing is I'm not able to keep up with it, and I'm afraid that if they start oversaturating with Star Wars movies, that people aren't going to be able to keep up with it, they're going to be confused and all that. I'm afraid that if they start oversaturating it, the movies will either get worse, or people will start to not care. Because it used to be that, like when they made Phantom Menace and Force Awakens, people were extremely excited about it. Like, everybody was excited to see these movies because it was the return of a franchise that a lot of people grew up with. I feel like with them pumping out a movie every year, I'm not sure if they're going to continue doing that after episode 9 or not, but if they do continue doing that, then I'm afraid that people are just going to get tired of it, and Star Wars is going to kind of lose its ability to bring people together for these kinds of events, because that's really what it did. Really, I'm more concerned about the quality rather than people getting disinterested, because personally, as a lifelong Star Wars fan, I'm sure that as long as the movies are still good, I will remain interested at least. I just hope that they don't get to the point where they're oversaturating Star Wars and just pumping out new movies for the sake of pumping out new movies, and they end up getting worse as a result. Number 8, as most fans know, when Disney bought Star Wars, they just completely wiped the slate clean and said everything in Star Wars that is not Clone Wars or the movies is not canon anymore. So they pretty much wiped the slate clean of like 30 some years of expanded universe material. Now, I'm not saying that I entirely disagree with this, because I can completely understand it. They wanted to be able to do this so they could tell the stories they want to tell and give the creators of the films and other media like the books or games or whatever more freedom to explore different time periods and different territories of Star Wars. So I do completely understand wanting to do this since it gives them less restraint with what they can do. However, it would have been nice for them to keep at least a few things that not necessarily would impact what they're trying to do with the movies, at least. I think it was a good move to decanonize stuff that was post Return of the Jedi, because of course if they're going to make movies after Return of the Jedi, then they would either have to make the old stories not canon, or they would have to follow very closely to what those stories told, which would mean they would have a lot less creative freedom. However, I think things like the Old Republic, or even some other smaller stories like Republic Commando, or other ones that are just people like a lot, Darth Bane, stuff like that. And of course, I know, they have brought back things like Thrawn, and they almost brought back Revan. They brought back Delta Squad and all these kinds of things. So it's not that they are necessarily trying to completely keep the EU out of the new stuff, because they are bringing things back gradually, which I am very happy about. 7 is not exploring plot threads that were set up by The Force Awakens in The Last Jedi. Now, most of these things I really was okay with. However, I understand that a lot of people were upset by it, and it would have been nice to learn about some of these things. For example, how Maz Kanata got possession of Luke's lightsaber, or explaining a little bit more about Snoke. Things like that people were expecting to see that didn't happen. And I understand they can go back in like books or comics or whatever and explain how those things came to be, but it still would have been nice in The Last Jedi if they had given at least a little bit of something for all of the fans who wanted these things to have. Number 6 is killing off the original trilogy characters a little bit too quickly. Now, I understand why they're doing this, at least I think I do. As far as what I'm understanding, it seems like they're trying to do this in order to make way for the new characters like Rey and Finn and Kylo Ren and Poe and whatnot. I think it would have been nice, definitely, to see a little bit more of these characters. For example, Han Solo and Luke and Leia, who now they can't do anything with because Carrie Fisher passed away. But at least with Han Solo and Luke Skywalker, it would have been nice to see more of them, because I really enjoyed how both were portrayed and how they were done in the new movies. And it would have been really great to see more of them, which is something I'll actually come back to in a little bit. It would have been nice to see more of the original characters, basically, and with them killing them off so quickly, it gives us pretty much no chance of that happening, of course, unless like Luke comes back as a Force ghost or something, which I wouldn't expect that to happen. I think that is something that they could have done a little bit better, and like I said, they could have, I think, kept Luke alive until at least episode 9. It is what it is. I'm fine with how they did it anyway, but it still would have been nice to see more of these characters. Number 5 is that it feels like the characters in the sequel trilogy are weaker than characters in past Star Wars films. For example, Captain Phasma, General Hux, Rose, Poe, and to an extent Rey. I think, or even Finn a little bit too. Really, most of them, I think, are in some ways a little weaker than in the past. Just as some examples, Phasma and Hux, what are their characters? They don't really have that much. I mean, Hux has more than Phasma does. They're really incredibly forgettable characters, and there's really nothing that interesting about them aside from Phasma looks cool. Those are kind of wasted characters. Rose, Kelly Marie Tran did fine acting as her. I don't think she's a particularly interesting character. Poe is okay, and he does have a couple of little arcs throughout the movies and stuff like that. I think he was a little bit weaker than he should have been. And then Rey, while I think she and Kylo Ren are the strongest of the new characters, I think some things about her could have been done a little better. So overall, I just think that some of the new characters are a bit weaker than, say, the original characters of Luke, Han, and Leia, or even Anakin, Padme, and Obi-Wan in the prequel trilogy. It's not to say I necessarily hate any of these characters. I actually think At least in The Last Jedi, Rey was a pretty decent character. Force Awakens, she also was, but I don't think quite to the same extent. I just think that in general they are a little bit weaker. Number 4 is kind of something that I feel like some fans wouldn't really care about, but for me, as someone who enjoys music and the music of Star Wars, this is kind of important, and that is that the musical score isn't as good as it was in past films. I understand that Star Wars has not always had incredibly fantastic film scores. For example, personally, Return of the Jedi and Attack of the Clones are the two weakest. Attack of the Clones, I think, only has a couple of memorable songs, and other than that, it's just not really that interesting for the most part. However, that seems to me kind of how things are with most of the new movie soundtracks. I think Force Awakens had a couple of good songs, but overall it was just kind of not incredibly great. Same thing with Rogue One, same thing with The Last Jedi. Solo, I think, had the best soundtrack out of them all overall, although I do think there are definitely songs on the others that are better than stuff on Solo, but I think overall that was probably the best one. As someone who enjoys the music of Star Wars and has been, for the most part, a little disappointed by the musical score of the movies, I just think that could have been done better. Number 3 is something that has to really do with all of the movies that have either been released already or are going to be released or are planned or whatever. And that is reliance on the original trilogy and characters that we already know. So, for example, Rogue One, Solo, and I would assume the Obi-Wan movie that I believe is still being planned, along with the Boba Fett movie, which I believe is also still being planned. Those all have to do with either the original trilogy, characters we know already, or both. I think they really should move away from that at some point very soon. Granted, it's nice to see the original kind of time period that we all know and love about Star Wars from the original trilogy and seeing these characters that we love come back. However, I think that over-reliance on the original trilogy and doing it for the sake of expanding on these characters that we already know, which it is good to expand on characters and give them a little bit more depth, but at some points I feel like it's not really needed. Like, for example, Solo, I thought it was a decent movie and I did enjoy it, and I thought it added some good things to Han Solo's character, but I don't necessarily think it was needed. So I would like them to kind of expand it a little bit, include some stuff even from the prequel era or even beyond that, like the Old Republic. Like I said, I'm a fan of the Old Republic, so I would like to see some stuff set way before the movies that we have now, or stuff like that. Number 2 has absolutely nothing to do with the movies, but it's something that I do feel quite strongly about, and that is that Disney gave the license to make video games to EA. Now, I am gonna say, first of all, I have only played one of the games that have come out since EA got the license to Star Wars, and that is Battlefront 2. I think I've played 1 or 2 of the mobile games and didn't really care for them, because I'm not really much of a fan of most mobile games. I can't get into it very well. I think overall, making EA the main publisher was kind of a mistake, even though I do think, for example, Battlefront 2 is a solid game and I do enjoy it. I think as far as things like their business practices, of course, with the whole controversy about Battlefront 2 and everything, that's gonna come up. But also them canceling projects that were already in the works, like the Darth Maul game. I forget what it was called now, but the Darth Maul game and 1313, and also a lot of people haven't been very pleased with the quality of the games. For example, the first Battlefront, I hadn't even played that and I was displeased with it. But also them just pumping out a bunch of mobile games and not really doing a whole lot of console releases, or at least in my case, like PC releases as well, but generally console releases, actual like video games that are not meant for phones and stuff like that. I would like to see more of those because, you know, back in like the early to mid 2000s, there were a lot of Star Wars games coming out, and granted, not all of them were great, but a lot of the best Star Wars games came out in the mid 2000s, like the Knights of the Old Republic games and the original Battlefronts, Republic Commando. Force Unleashed came out more in the late 2000s, but I would count that as well. And also EA is kind of moving a little bit more, it seems like, towards multiplayer games and stuff like Battlefront. The two Battlefront games are mostly multiplayer focused, although it does seem like they are working on a single player game, which is that Jedi game. I forget what it's called, but the one that they announced at E3 very uneventfully. EA is not exactly the greatest company to have the Star Wars license, basically. And at number one is something that I was sort of talking about earlier with the original trilogy characters being killed off, and that means that there is not going to be a reunion for Han, Luke, and Leia. Now, I understand that there have been reunions, like in Force Awakens, Han reunited with Leia, and in Last Jedi, Luke reunited with Leia. However, we didn't get to see all three of them on screen at once doing something, whether it be them just talking to each other and kind of getting back together again, or taking part in some kind of battle where they're just kind of working together like they always used to. That would have been really awesome to see, but of course now that can't happen because Han and Luke, like I said, are dead in Star Wars, and Carrie Fisher is dead in real life. And I think that was definitely a missed opportunity, because I think that's something that a lot of Star Wars fans would have loved to see, because these are all characters that we grew up with, and we really would have liked to see them come back all together again as a group and as a team again, like they did back in the original trilogy. Like I said, I'm still okay with what they ended up doing, but this is just something that I think was definitely a missed opportunity. So overall, that's pretty much everything I wanted to say. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. Do you agree with anything on my list? Do you have any other things that you dislike about the new movies or Disney's acquisition of Star Wars and all that? Let me know in the comments below. And that pretty much wraps up the video, so I'll see you all next time.